Unseen in the background, fate was quietly slipping lead into the boxing glove. P.G. Wodehouse. Very good, Jeeves. The Daily Grind, Chapter 167. James rolled over in bed, pulling the blankets around himself like a cocoon. They'd gotten new blankets recently. Recently to him, meaning sometime in the last 2 years, and he still wasn't fully used to the feeling of them on his skin. The sprawling bed that took up most of the room's floor space currently held himself, and Anesh, who was reading under the warm light of a desk lamp, and a dramatically snoring Alana. It was a little too warm, a little too crowded, and also perfect. It had struck him suddenly, earlier in the evening, that his life felt perfect, lived in, occupied, and fully his own. He had challenges, but they were ones that he took on of his own volition. He probably had enemies, but they existed in the abstract now. And he had partners. To say that James didn't have much experience with relationships would be a bit of an understatement. He had pretty much no experience with romance, and his time with Alana and Anesh had, for a while, been plagued with him constantly worrying that he was going to, or actively, screwing something up. He'd poked fun at Anesh for the same feeling, but he should have just been honest and shared that he felt it too. But their relationship hadn't actually changed that much, had it? They were still the closest companions, still trusted each other with their lives, they just also shared a bed, and kisses, and other things. More comfort, both emotional and physical. They could be vulnerable around each other, in a way they never really had before. James hadn't really thought any of this, exactly. Not now, buried in blankets and on the nicest bed he'd ever owned. Instead, he'd more felt it. A settling ember of warmth in the core of his soul. Then he finished rolling over and was asleep almost instantly. Some time later, James dreamed. It was a strange place, an upstairs attic, segmented into blocky cubes of space, perched atop a snow-capped peak, but also deep within the sewer complex that ran under an endless road. He was everywhere he had ever been, and nowhere that mattered. He was also running from something, running in that ineffectual dream state way, where your legs burned but you didn't move, where the pursuer was always gaining on you, forever, even if you were never caught. It was a black shadow behind him, studded with stars and impulses. It stalked after him. It was always stalking after him, even as he failed to run and the landscape shifted underfoot, cycling through bad footing and sharp edges. The shadow was always there, waiting. Dreaming or not, it was always there. But it had changed somehow. It was aware of him. Before, his depression was a natural consequence of brain chemistry. A parasite James couldn't really be that mad at. It just did its job. But now, it was aware. In a grim, predatory way, somewhere deep below the surface of chemistry, psychology, and biology, his depression had been transformed into a being that hated him, that was trying as hard as possible to erase James and replace him with itself. Which wouldn't work, really. Even dreaming and terrified, James knew he was stronger than it, but it was still trying, and he was still running. He passed by a crumbling wall covered in etchings of all the different things he had learned to advance his lessons. He passed a precipice that showed him golden streamers out of the dream, links to Anesh and Sarah. He walked over a bottomless foul pit that sparkled in its depths with the points of light from his skills, and the creature followed. James passed by another figure, an orange glitter that spoke in directions and destinations. The words were strangely real, and his sleeping mind woke slightly, folding a wall of stabilized dream around them. "Thanks," James told the map. "Any time," the map replied easily, "especially if that time is spent on the road and not waiting around." James rolled his dreaming eyes. To be fair, his mind woke up a bit more as he spoke, but held within the dream. "I'm not really waiting, I'm just not covering geographical distance." "Same thing," the map rippled. It wasn't a person yet, not really, but it was getting there, and apparently it was learning Snark as its first language. though James knew that it wouldn't be free to make that choice until he completed the task it was created for, which meant, at least a little bit, a road trip. He would have grinned, but the last road trip he'd gone on had been a bit of a problem. "Time's up," the map said, pointing at the falling dream wall and the nightmare seeping through. James sighed and felt himself toss and turn in the real world, his body moving even as his lucidity was pulled away, and he fell back into the terror of endless flight. Dark rooms, slippery falls, always running from a monster that wouldn't die. Rejection, failure, failing the people who trusted him, failing the world before it had a chance to thrive. Anxieties piled on fears, dragging James down. The nightmare stretched on. James just fled, somewhere else. Elsewhere. Simon dozed on a cot in the response hall. Hall was a high-minded way of saying the basement they'd taken over, but it still worked. They had a couple rooms here, set up as communal sleeping spots for people who were on call but maybe needed a rest. It was a forward-looking precaution. Response was growing, for sure, but they currently had more people than problems, and the fact that they often saved on telepad usage by staying out in the field until the next call came in meant that there were often not a lot of people around here to take advantage of the beds. But Simon was pretty much always on call, even when he wasn't scheduled. He stayed here, dozing lightly, and waiting for the next problem that he could solve. Dozing and being someone else. It had taken about 3 days after the assault on the lair from status quo, after the death of his partner, for Simon to notice that sometimes he looked in the mirror and saw the wrong face. That he'd seen James. His James, not the other one. He'd always rolled his eyes at the people who apparently couldn't tell from context clues which James they were talking about. Looking back at him. A month later, and sometimes he forgot which one he was. He'd look down and see hands that weren't his, because in that moment he wasn't Simon. Someone would call a name, and he wouldn't know if he was meant to respond or not. And when he slept, which he did rarely these days... "You really need to sleep more," James told him. Simon wasn't as good at dreaming as a lot of members of the Order inexplicably seemed to be, so he couldn't exactly scowl. But he wasn't fully asleep anyway, so he gave it a shot. "Don't give me that look," James flicked his nose. "Especially not with our face." Simon tried to say something. He was sitting against a tree, looking out over a river that he had never seen before from atop a small cliff. He'd been here a lot as a kid. It was a spot his parents had always loved, and he'd never seen it before once. He glanced down to where James sat next to him. His right arm and James's left were overlapped, blurred together into the same shape. "Sorry," James said sheepishly. "I'm not keeping away very well." Simon didn't know how to tell him that he didn't need to do that. That he'd caught this chunk of him, at the moment of death, explicitly so he could be here. Yeah, Simon's James sighed. "His brain isn't built for it." He trailed off, and the two of them sat and watched the river. Bit by bit, Simon familiarized himself with it. With the muddy bank that always crumbled slightly before you thought it would when you stood on it. With the underwater plants that absolutely weren't eels but felt like it when they brushed against your leg. With the water that was too cold, especially when it was sunny out. With all the things the ghost of James remembered. Until there weren't two thoughts, one of recognition and one of alienation, just familiarity. Still split. One of them had lived this after all, but there was less of a divide. James lifted their arm and flexed intermingled fingers with raised eyebrows. "Neat," he said. "Why?" "Because," Simon wanted to tell him, "I am getting tired of being me." "Not a good reason, man." James shook his head. "It's okay to let me go, you know. I don't know how, but the support group could probably help." The sun sat on the river. "You'd die," Simon said, or tried to. Yeah, I mean, it sucked the first time." James laughed, and Simon felt the dream shudder around them as he made light of his own demise. "But hey, I've got practice now." The night cooled in the dream. "It's not fair," Simon tried to say. Nothing in the past 3 years has been fair, James's ghost shrugged. What are you going to do about it? Maybe you can take over, Simon finally said out loud, and I'll sit here and watch the trees. His friend and partner gave him a shocked look, full of fear and unplaced anger. Maybe I should stop running, Simon suggested, almost to himself. Maybe we should just double down on what we were always doing, being one person. Maybe this mind isn't built for it, but so what? Magic. That's all. It's magic. You might lose yourself, James whispered, the ghost shivering with regret. I don't want to kill you, just so part of me sticks around. What is me, anyway? Simon asked. And the question, even in his half-awake dream, sparked something in him. What was he? Who had he become? He'd been a delivery driver before being stolen by a dungeon monster and held prisoner for well over a year. Then he'd been a survivor, then a delver, then a teacher, a fighter, a partner, a part of something bigger, a responder, a knight. And for all the parts of that which mattered, James had been there with him. The two of them had started spending so much time together in a full link through the Skulljacks that they had kind of ceased to be two people anyway. So why did Simon care now? Why did either of them, especially James, who was already dead and had nothing to lose anyway? The dream shook, along with Simon's physical body. He wanted to stay, to say more, but maybe he didn't need to. Also, he was out of time. He woke up to someone lightly jostling him awake. Hey! The kid, Marcus, stepped back. Everyone's tied up. We need a search and rescue. You awake enough? Orange summer evening's ready to go. Simon and James looked down at their hands and flexed familiar fingers. I'm good, they said, swinging their feet off the cot and rapidly waking up as they jammed them into shoes. Let's go. The dispatcher didn't stick around, trusting Simon to hustle once he was ready, and striding down the hallway to the main room as he pulled on his coat, Simon passed by the small security office that had a window into its interior. He caught the thin light of his reflection in it. His partner's face looked back at him, apprehension evident. Simon smiled. A second later, James did the same. Then he winked at Simon, and the two of them moved on. He had places to be right now, people to save. Maybe he could catch up with himself in the next dream. But after all that had happened, they were still here. Still themselves. Elsewhere. Miles sat in the front seat of his car. Well, not his car, another rental, another city. He was getting good at adapting to different feelings of acceleration and potencies of brakes. He was also getting good at a lot of other things. A lot of weird, esoteric things, like how to identify the caliber of a gun by the sound of a shot, and then how to pull up the menu for the bracer on his arm and toggle it to intercept that specific bullet. Probably wouldn't save him for the first one, but if that one didn't kill him, he'd gotten fast enough at it to make sure the follow-up shots absolutely wouldn't. Or other things, like getting good at subtly mimicking accents in a way that made people just a little more comfortable talking to him. Or hell, even just asking questions in the first place. Starting conversations with random people, asking strange things, but using a lot of little tricks to not stick in their memory. He'd asked once why they didn't just get Planner to blip their presence out of people's thoughts. Nate had rolled his eyes, but James had given him a real answer. First off, it was kind of evil, but also it wasn't practical. On a very real level, Planner was the act of scheduling and allocating time to projects, and Miles was not a good carrier for that particular infomorph. When he'd asked why they didn't make an infomorph that was raised on James Bond movies, Nate had gone into a very in-depth explanation of all the ways that Bond was a bad spy, while James had quietly slipped out of the room and left Miles to his terrible fate. Right now, he was wishing that he'd brought coffee. Any kind of coffee, magical or otherwise, though after a month of this kind of thing, Miles had started to develop a belief that cheap gas station coffee was, in fact, some kind of arcane fluid. But he hadn't even thought to pick up any of that, and now he was stuck here. This kind of thing, and here, were a little interlinked. He'd been catapulted away from helping JP with the cleanup of Taunton, and set back on what he had figured were more typical rogue duties. In this case, following and snooping on a particular individual, who was an alchemist. Or at least a member of the Guild of Alchemists. Or the Alchemists Guild? Miles couldn't, and on principle wouldn't, remember the difference. Either way, this guy, who was about 70 years old and who drove like he was a teenager with their first car, was the first person Miles had been tailing all day. He was, in brief, a bit surreal. The man wore custom-fitted, hand-tailored shirts. He also shopped at Dollar General and carried his own bags to his car. His car, which was some kind of fancy-ass BMW that had been waxed to a mirror shine. The man lived in a goddamn hillside mansion, the sole building perched up a winding trail into a wooded realm. Miles hadn't even bothered to follow him up. He knew a trap when he saw one, even if it was a very pleasant-looking drive of a trap. Instead, he'd backtracked slightly and parked in the small strip mall down the street. Unless his target had an interest in visiting one of the dotted farms along the road or had some kind of secret access tunnel, which was not out of the question, really, then he'd probably pass by here when he left anyway. So Miles waited, keeping an eye out for that ridiculous car, his window of opportunity to go ransack, to go carefully search the mansion of an ancient alchemist somewhere in the nebulous future. Of course, while he thought the word ancient, Miles was pretty aware that this guy was just regular old. By this point, the rogues had been made aware of the existence of things like the old gun or the last line of defense, and the fact that the latter one at least probably predated the existence of the country was kind of weird. Ancient was getting a lot more relative. There was a stray thought, the kind that he couldn't keep away sometimes, that maybe one day he'd be that ancient. Miles wondered if he'd be able to keep his perspective. Would he still be this? Sitting in a rental car, planning to turn some guy's sock drawer inside out looking for secrets? Would he still be having fun? Because there was no mistaking it, this was fun. Even just sitting in the car and waiting had turned into a heart-pounding game of chicken with fate itself. Although it was stretching on a little bit, and the warm car interior was more comfortable than it maybe should have been compared to the chilly, dark, rainy day outside. Miles didn't really intend for what was supposed to be a long blink to turn into a short nap, but that's what happened. When he woke up, he swore as he realized that he missed his window of opportunity and he was going to have to try this again tomorrow. He dreamed of being very old, but still having fun. Elsewhere, Ava's bedtime had become something of a running joke around the lair. Jean, her mom, had decided after a long conversation with a few other survivors that made their home here to reject the offer of a hotel room somewhere or even a trip back home and to stay in one of the guest rooms the lair had on offer now. Jean and Ava weren't actually from Taunton. They had survived the disaster there relatively unscathed financially. Jean still had a small apartment around Chattanooga, though apparently she was being fined a half-month's rent for being late on rent, in a move that would have crippled her 2 months ago, and yet, now, wasn't such a big deal. Going home just didn't feel right at the moment. Partially because she didn't feel safe out in the world. James had said, offhandedly once, that her daughter was one of the safest people on Earth. Because humans, you see, did not have natural defenses against infomorphs. She had extrapolated this without realizing it to mean that there was a whole ecosystem of things that killed humans, and no one knew about it. No one could stop it or fight back. Except, of course, the people in this building, where she had coincidentally chosen to stay for a while for completely unrelated reasons. Possibly because her daughter had made friends with several of the Camercondas, and she didn't want to disappoint her daughter. Obviously. The Camercondas had actually terrified Jean when she'd first gotten here, and then, after talking to one of them for more than 2 minutes, had broken her heart with how horrible their story had been. By this point, if she was being honest, she stuck around probably because she had friends with the Camercondas more than her daughter did. It also helped that there were not any outside obligations at the moment. Her 2-week absence, while she had been mind-controlled by an apparently non-hostile patch of highway, had led to Jean losing her job, and she couldn't really blame her employers for that, much as she wanted to blame someone, anyone, for something. Being here, though, she could keep busy. She helped out in the kitchen, mostly, or helped Karen with whatever the eternally moving woman needed. At one point, she found herself in an attic that went on for too long, being instructed on the proper care routine for a living rain cloud that was on life support. Sarah had given her a small wooden dowel after that, and told her to share it with someone important to her. Though Jean had instantly thought of her daughter, she hadn't gotten around to it yet, partially because, despite her newfound free time and all the quality time she was spending with Ava, the girl was remarkably good at vanishing when she did not want to be found. Or, like now, when she sensed that she was supposed to be doing something. Jean poked her head into the mostly empty kitchen, nodded to Knife and Fangs as she scanned the half-lit room for her daughter. There was no sign of Ava, and the Camerconda shook his head when she gave him a questioning glance. Jean sighed. It was 2 minutes after 9 p.m., and she knew it would be another half hour until this was resolved. Ava's bedtime was becoming something of a running joke for the Order. Currently, the young girl was absolutely not in bed like she was supposed to be. As someone who would be turning 13 on her next birthday, the concept of a bedtime was frankly rather insulting. Not that she'd really thought that deeply about the indignity of being assigned time to sleep. It was more a prevailing ongoing sense that she was somehow being disrespected for wanting to stay up until midnight doing more fun things. Ava had once told James that she could stay up very late, up to and including midnight, and for some reason that confused the young girl, James had laughed. Right now, though, no one was laughing. Right now, Ava was sneaking. The basement that Response occupied was constantly busy. It was apparently plucked from a university somewhere, according to Harvey. Lots of maintenance corridors and bits where wire grates had walled off small storage spaces before they'd been cleared out, all of it occasionally coming together in one or two larger open rooms. One they used for all the phones and stuff. The other as a kind of hub for the Response people to relax in. But there was a bunch of small hiding places around, and Ava was having fun exploring them. There was a storage area here that was way off in the corner. They hadn't even cleaned it out yet, it just had a bunch of rugs in it. The carpet was scratchy and unpleasant, but crawling through them was like a forest of padded trees, surrounded by the smell of old fabric. That was fun. There was a cabinet in the break room that was bigger on the inside than it should have been, and Ava could fit herself inside and poke around for a while. And of course there was the dispatch floor itself, which she absolutely was not supposed to be in. But she slipped in anyway, hidden, perched on her head just under her hood, both of them stealthed against prying eyes, the little infomorph working to bend perception around them. Ava still had to be careful to be out from underfoot. She didn't want to get stepped on, and she didn't want to be in anybody's way. But she really loved coming down here and listening in, watching response teams joking with each other, hearing the tension in the dispatchers' voices go up and down as they took calls and sent out solutions. Sometimes a team would come back injured, and Ava would hold her breath as they were checked out, but she'd never seen anything too bad. Oftentimes they'd be checked out by Nikhil, who would come running, something green and complex shifting on his arm as he turned serious injuries into minor inconveniences, or minor wounds into nothing. Ava had kind of decided that Nikhil was cute, which was a first for her, but it didn't diminish the intensity of her goal to one day do what he did. She hid in the corner and watched response operations for a while, just sitting and feeling like she was as cool as they were to be here. But for all of her sneaking around, Ava was still a kid, and she was a kid who had a busy day every day, and she was asleep sooner rather than later, hidden perched on her head, also dozing off, the infomorph fading into her hair as she did so. Upstairs, Jean opened the door to the supply closet looking for her daughter and found nothing. As she eased the door shut and turned to head down the hallway to continue her search, she revealed a member of the Order standing there looking a little awkward. Message for you, ma'am," Davis said politely, the older man being a perfect gentleman. "Planner wants you to know that your kid fell asleep on schedule, and—" he cleared his throat. "Would you please fetch her from the back left corner of the response dispatch floor? If you're not too busy." Jean stared at the older man for a while, who had the good grace to look a little uncomfortable with the situation, before she sighed. "Thanks." The exasperated mother shook her head. Tell Planner thank you too for me. Which one is response? Third basement, Davis told her. Have a good night, ma'am, he called over his shoulder, walking off to deliver another message from the infomorph that was permanently hosted by research these days. By the time Jean found Ava, she and Hidden were fast asleep. The two girls dreamed of flying. Elsewhere, Anesh had been asleep in the rather Spartan studio apartment that he rented near his second job for most of the night. Soon he'd have to wake up, go to work, do brain things, but right now he just rolled over and pushed himself back into dreamland. He'd been having a dream about an unreal future. Some sliver of it yet remained, and he tried to will himself back to that moment, of standing on the edge of an orbiting star dock, watching something impossibly large, a ship unmooring itself and beginning to slide out into open space. It carried, he knew, the collective hope of Earth, though why he couldn't say. Anesh didn't know if the dream was a happy or a sad one. He just wanted to see what happened next. Dreaming alone had actually become kind of novel for Anesh. Not this specific Anesh, there were 4 of him active currently, but for the collective Anesh in general. Most Aneshes, when they slept, tried to do so at the same time, so they could resync their personalities and memories while they were unconscious. It was convenient that way. And this Anesh, too, would teleport back every week or so to link back up. But most nights, more than any of the other copies of himself, he slept alone. It was strange to be the one doing the sleeping alone, when he had parallel memories of spending most nights sleeping with James or Alana, and yet he had exactly as much personal space as he wanted. He got to sleep with his partners every night, and he got to sleep alone every night, and due to the human mind's preference for remembering the nice parts of stuff, he never felt crowded or lonely, respectively. Instead, he kind of got the best parts of both. Warm and loved, and also no one stealing his blankets and all the legroom he could ever want. Dreams were an exception, though. Each Anesh always knew which dreams were their own. It was part of how they all knew they were copies of the original, and how they knew that the first Anesh had already died. And dreaming alone was somehow becoming novel to him. What a strange life he lived. His dream came back into focus slowly. He was talking to people. The time dreadnought was complete. The endless pathway had been breached. The Admiral needed something. She always needed something. And there was a ringing, somewhere distant, a ringing that got louder and louder and louder. Anesh woke up, glaring at the ceiling. It was still dark out, but there were a cluster of glow-in-the-dark star stickers staring back at him that James had gotten him as an unnecessary housewarming gift. God damn it, he groaned, reaching over and expertly slapping the button on his phone that disabled the alarm, before flopping that arm over his eyes and trying to get the blood moving to his fingers. The dream was gone. No one else with him to stabilize him into sleep, to create a shared end to the story. Just an alarm clock that woke him up with brutal efficacy, and the longing for a conclusion that wouldn't be coming. Dreams, for this Anesh, didn't have satisfying endings. They were a lot like real life in that way. Interesting stuff happened, and then there was an abrupt cutoff. He wasn't as masochistic as James was in thinking that nightmares were part of the fun of being a dreaming human, but there was a certain thrill to shared dreams, where you never quite knew if the other minds you were dreaming with were going to go the way you expected. With his own dreams, though, Anesh always knew how they ended. With the sound of his alarm, and his own frustration that he couldn't stay in bed longer. It was a Monday, which meant that relatively soon, members of the Order would once again venture into peril for the betterment of themselves and the world. But it also meant that Anesh was going to be late for work if he didn't get off his ass. He might be a genius who was getting really good at orbital physics, but he worked with 100 other people who were all smarter than he was, and while he wasn't the most replaceable person in the world, there were only so many times he could tell John that he had a family emergency before his immediate supervisor would start to get annoyed. Anesh swung his feet out of bed and rubbed at his eyes, and then he smiled, because even though he had to get out of bed and experience all the downsides of a Monday, he got to go work on a space program. It was, all on its own, a special kind of dream, and it made him feel a lot better about not getting to go dungeon diving personally. Elsewhere, Clutter Ascent lived in a dream. People were real, she knew this, but they were white smoke and dim lights moving through her. Nothing like the warm sparks that she had made herself. Walls were real too. Her own walls were more real, but there were other walls outside. They stretched on forever. They were labyrinth paths and deep secrets that she could not understand. Certain actions were also real, moments frozen in time, bits of happy glass that caught the light and smoke and made it glitter for an instant, gone in a blink if she didn't catch them. But just because they weren't as easy to see in her drifting, sleepy state didn't make them any less precious. They were all important, even the ones she couldn't feel but could hear moving around below her. They didn't come into herself. Somehow she knew it was an old fear that she couldn't quite understand but had been told about by someone once. But they were still here. They protected her, and because of them she didn't have to make any war sparks, so they were also real and also important. Clutter Ascent was almost always dreaming, but that didn't make her not aware. Her dreams were everything that happened, and everything shared with her. She dreamed of sugary breakfasts, awkward attempts to learn the guitar, laughter, and stories. So many stories. The important and very real people would read to her when they visited, or read to each other. Tales they seemed to pull out of nowhere, like she pulled her sparks. At first, she had thought they were trying to influence her somehow. But then, over time, she started to understand them a little bit better. Stories were both real and not real, and also something else. They did not happen, but it didn't matter, because they could be real anyway, and they weren't being pulled from nowhere, but pulled from books, which were real in an incredibly dense way. They were real much like the people were real, lights and smoke, but the more she listened to them, the denser and more solid the smoke became, the brighter the light shone, and the more it multiplied. And so Clutter Ascent had listened, enraptured, to 100 different stories, drawing meaning and truth from tales of distant cities, strange creatures, kind wizards, and daring adventurers. Many of the stories talked of colors. She didn't know exactly how colors could be described, but she took what she could from it and made more sunsets. The smoke and lights of the people that visited her stopped often to observe the new sunsets, which was good. They were quite nice. Clutter Ascent stirred in her sleep as a thought echoed throughout herself. She should write a book. Apparently people did it all the time, judging by the seemingly endless library that was growing in her depths. She should add to it, share a story in turn. But how? She had no stories. This was a problem. Clutter Ascent turned in her dream, and, mostly out of an unknown reflex, pulled the smoke of reality out of several of the stories that she had been told. Then she collapsed them down into the format that had become familiar to her. Pages, a cover, several images, several more words, a beginning, a middle, and an end. No. No end. Endings were sad, because even when they were happy, the story was over. No end to her book. The dream receded as the book hissed into reality. It didn't have the same smoke and light that the other books or walls or people did. It looked like her walls, or her own sparks, or something different, a secret third thing. But it was there, sitting with the stack of other stories that they had brought her. Clutter Ascent gave a yawn that echoed across a place that was not and a place that was. That had been exhausting. She swirled in satisfaction, though, as she drifted back to the dream and watched a piece of smoke approach the bookshelf. Elsewhere, Frequency of Sunlight slept in an unfamiliar bed. Which is to say, she slept in a bed. For the last several years, ever since waking up to the reality of being truly alive, she had mostly slept in a pile of other camera condas, or curled up in a corner under a desk somewhere. Even upon being teleported out of the body of her creator and into the freedom of the true world, she had spent a lot of time sleeping curled up under things, though James had, in his own words, quote, raided every Bed Bath & Beyond within a 10-mile radius for pillows and blankets and shit, end quote, to provide a mass of collective bedding for her people. It had taken her a month or two to figure out what a Bed Bath & Beyond was, and then another week to think of looking up how many there were within that distance. There was exactly one, and she'd assumed it was another endless space, judging by the volume of blankets, until Deb had explained human logistics to her. Human logistics was its own brand of terrifying, really, but it was one of the first conversations she had ever had with Deb, which made it special. Shortly after that, she had chosen a name. Someone had told her that a name should be something either important to her, or that she wouldn't mind hearing for the rest of her life, or that she pulled out of a hat. She didn't have a hat. She didn't know how long her life would be either, so she had picked something that was as important to her as possible, which was the way the sunset looked. When they had first teleported her out of the tower, out of the prison, it had been night, and the next day had been a buzz of indoor activities and naps. By the time she actually got the chance to go outside and look at the sky, it had been orange and pale blue, an almost perfect sunset, colors that she had never seen before, didn't even know that they could exist like that, painted across the entire, massive horizon of a world that was bigger than anything she had ever seen. Her lens didn't work like human eyes, but she could still see in color. She could see the patterns and textures and frequencies of light. Frequency of Sunlight had named herself the most important thing she could, with her nascent grasp of language, and accidentally started a tradition for her entire people. Life had gone strangely since then. A sentence that she had heard a lot of the humans of the Orders say regularly, but it seemed to fit her too, so maybe she'd fit in with them as well. She'd grown closer to the human that would become a partner to her, explored strange places, eaten a lot of strange foods, and, perhaps strangest of all, she had drifted away from the people she had grown up with, and become a far more independent serpent than she ever really expected. Not that any of them had really expected much of anything. And now she lay in a curved arch, back pressed against her girlfriend, sleeping without fear, and dreaming of seeing new colors. Frequency of Sunlight's dream self craned her neck to follow a dot of something that was on the edge of yellow, but wasn't quite. Frequency of Sunlight's physical self flopped over Deb's chest, eliciting a muffled oof from the woman. Next to her partner, lying on her back, and now mildly crushed, Deb's eyes instantly flicked open, with the practice of someone who had gone through a nursing internship. "Sonny," she muttered, tilting her head down to look at the camera conda stretched across her and turning in her sleep. "Why?" Deb glanced sideways at the digital clock on the dresser. Well, she had to get up in 20 minutes anyway. May as well take the early alarm as a sign. The camera conda didn't answer, for her part, just gave a low, hissing snore, pinned down the color that she was trying to find in her subconscious, and went limp as she drifted back to a deeper sleep. It took Deb 5 minutes of careful movements to free her arms and slide out of bed without waking up her snoring girlfriend. Though part of that might have been the comfort of the warm weight, and less the fact that she was actually trapped. Elsewhere, Rufus was having a nightmare. He was back in hell, back in the deep places where death was common and violence was frequent, trust was an illusion. Where the walls never had clean lines, where the hiding places were always occupied, where nothing grew that was not angry, and fertile spots to set down roots were fought over with a fury. And yet he had companions. Others, some like him, some not. They didn't have names. He didn't have a name then, either. They weren't important. There was a boxy one that he got along with well, another frame like himself that liked to play tackle him. There was a larger one of them that was always alert, and another who was always trying to understand the world around them. In reality, they were long gone. Part of Rufus knew that, even dreaming, but for a moment, his nightmare was just a dream, and he saw them again. Then it was the nightmare that he always knew it would be. One by one they died. Their desk shattered by something larger than them, his little farm crushed. They were pushed into hunting for sustenance, pushed to fight, to kill. They got good at it, but it cost them. There were 14 in his band, then 12, then 11, then 2 weeks of survival and safety, and then a single accident, and in blood and pain their numbers dropped to 3. The other one, the one like him, his friend who enjoyed play fighting, just stopped. Sat down one day and never got back up. The big guy left shortly after, or maybe Rufus had been the one to leave. He couldn't remember, but he relived it both ways, dreamed the scene 100 times, over and over. The pain of being alone again. It was always his fault. The nightmare skipped, a needle dancing on a record. He was no longer alone. He had gone to one of the tall places in his quest for survival and isolation, and there found others like himself. Well, not like him. They were bulkier. There were other forms with them, but they were his size and moved as a pack. Truth seekers, looking for answers to the world. The tower held the truth for them. Rufus had never been a believer, but he had been their friend. The eager one with the paper blanket, the tool user. Together they had climbed the tower to where Rufus could see the entirety of the world that he had known and more besides in the distance. They hadn't even come close to the top. A beast of liquid darkness had been unleashed, rolling over them like a wave. None of the others had gotten away. Rufus only lived because he had held back from the door where they were sure they'd find truth behind it. The needle skipped again. The nightmare jumped forward. He was on a metal island in the middle of the sea. His raft had worked. He was alone out here, alone to farm and think and not remember. A coiled thing from the sea found him. So did a flock of white sheets from above. They brought him survivors on the waves. Rufus was no longer alone. Eventually, they traveled together. Eventually, Rufus was alone again. If the nightmare kept going, it would eventually take him as far as he could go. Eventually, he would find a door that could never open, using the tricks that he'd learned from the truth seekers. And when that door did open, Rufus would not be alone anymore. And he'd try his best to save these new ones, the tricks from the islanders put to work, but it wouldn't change anything. Or maybe it would. Rufus woke up before the nightmare went that far, before he went from remembering the past to projecting the future. He was alone, but he wasn't alone. He had his garden, of plants both terrestrial and otherwise. He had his own little space. Not a lot of space by human standards, but it was pleasant and safe. And outside there were others. Others that would accept him, share with him, protect him. Friends? He hesitated even now to call them friends. But they were. Rufus just hoped that this time he wouldn't find himself truly alone again. Elsewhere. Planner! One of Momo's dream selves got the Infomorph's attention. Need your advice on something. Yes, ma'am. Planner's dream form was a simple rotating cube of tentacles. Momo considered rolling her eyes at them. She could do that. She was pretty deep in her own head right now. Feeling exasperated while dreaming was a trick when you weren't intentionally crammed down to a floaty subconscious level through a mix of skulljack tricks, red totems, and LSD. Momo had never been into the drugs, actually, aside from, like, getting drunk once at a friend's house and getting stoned repeatedly at a different, cooler, and more responsible friend's house, but she had made the jump to a world where drugs gave you superpowers pretty easily. If asked, James would deny that drugs gave you superpowers, but the sort of floaty disconnect between your omnipresent anxieties and your appreciation for the beauty of the world that Momo got from a small dose of LSD was critical to shaping and understanding the lines and patterns of the totem shapes that she'd assigned, so James could shut up. Besides, he'd built a mech that needed a hypnotic dissociative episode to pilot, so he didn't get to talk. Don't call me ma'am, she reflexively told Planner, waking mind and dreaming self mixing effortlessly. Need some help here. What the fuck am I looking at? Momo was looking at what she was pretty sure was a mental imprint of an authority, but it was dormant, maybe even dead. She couldn't tell. Her human mind wasn't built for this kind of information patterning, but that's why Planner had a summer home in her cerebellum. Nothing, Planner said, humming with the scritching of pen on paper. I cannot see it, but it is there in its appointed place. Okay, quick check. Can you not see it because it's too different from you, because it's dead or dormant, or because it's abstractly not on the schedule? Momo pried, one of her secondary dreaming selves poking at Planner's angular bits. The second option, part 1 or 2, Planner dryly replied. I am not in the abstract. I am capable of seeing beyond the schedule perfectly well. Cool, Momo nodded, cutting them off. Okay, follow up. Why isn't it moving? This is a strange place. Planner rotated, making an idle comment. The first Momo had ever heard them say, actually. Planner was kind of a stickler for precise language. I do not know why it is dormant. According to you, all the proper steps were taken, all the proper resources allocated. It should be live. Momo examined the authority's form. It almost looked like a larva, if tools had a larval form. Half insectile thought, half smooth metal and waiting potential. One of her other selves, the one that was the input from the red totem that showed her personal connections, could see a slight line forming between it and herself, but not, crucially, between it and anything else. Why? She couldn't even properly sigh down here. Momo was so tired, and so close to despair, and she couldn't sigh like she wanted to. Why won't it work? Does it know Nameless is dying and just can't link up or something? It does not appear to know anything. Planner gave a written hum again. I can see clearly. Unshielded in any way, it is waiting for something. Looking for a command. Yes, there, deeper in. It waits for an order. It isn't dead at all. Momo glared at the dormant authority. So why, then? She scowled from a half-dozen dreamed faces. One of Momo looked over at Planner, still politely perched over the flat ground that stretched off to an off-color sky over the horizon. I don't know what to do. She pulled back from the dream to adjust her arm a bit, pushing away a muscle cramp before diving back in effortlessly. What options do we have left? Momo asked Planner, who had shifted positions while she'd been gone. I think, Planner said, affixing one of its eyes on Momo, that this has very little to do with what you yourself are doing. You think Nameless is doing this? Momo asked, already knowing the answer. Yes, Planner replied, unwilling to lie to Momo in any meaningful way. The deeper I look at the authority, the more I understand. It is not like me, but its complexity is elegant. It requires orders. It feeds off a strange form of acceptance. This one appears quite healthy, as much as I am qualified to determine that. However, when I look at the mind we are visiting, I find no drive to give those orders. Nor does your friend appear to have accepted its own place in the order's structure, in anything's structure. Both of those thoughts are alien to it. There is no complexity or subtlety here for an infomorph like the Authority to feed off of. You're saying Nameless isn't a person, Momo accused, anger rising through the haze of her subconscious. You don't think it's real. I believe the artificial mind is as real as you would find a desert real, Planner rebutted. It exists, undeniably, but it is unique in the limit it has on supporting life. The tentacles forming a cube unfolded and then folded themselves back up again, nervously. I could not survive here. I do not believe the Authority could either. I am rather surprised the Nameless One has managed to come so close to what you call personhood with the finite resources at its disposal. Momo sent a ping out along the Skulljack connection, almost out of idle reflex. The AI didn't even reply with a denial, simply ignored the request for a deeper link. Abruptly, the young woman shook Planner away from her active thoughts, shoved herself out of the dream, yanked the plug out of her Skulljack, pivoted in her sitting position, and punched her desk so hard it cracked the wood and broke 2 fingers. Then she sighed. Then she screamed. Then she got up to go find Reed and see if she could get any more of those remove broken bone purples, because holy shit, her hand hurt now. Here, James rolled over, throwing the blankets into a haphazard pile. His nightmare receded as he woke up, fleeting memories of a dozen faraway dreams leaving his head like butterflies. "What time's it?" he muttered to Inesh. "You have been asleep for about 2 hours," Inesh told him. "Get back to it. I'll wake you up when it's time to go buy mountaineering gear, okay?" James nodded, or tried to anyway. "Okay," he said, face down in a pillow. He stayed there for a good 20 seconds, Inesh watching him with a raised eyebrow, before he pulled a blanket up over his shoulders and rolled over to fold an arm around Alana. Inesh just smiled and went back to his book. Looked like James was having a fun dream.